Good afternoon and welcome to today's Trust and Estates webinar, Managing Risk in Private Foundations, Compliance Fundamentals. This webinar is sponsored by Foundation Source. I'm Susan Lipp, Editor-in-Chief of Trust and Estates, and I'll be your moderator today. In a moment, I'll be turning things over to our speaker, but first let me explain how you can get the most out of this event. To improve your viewing and listening experience, you can move your webcast windows around by dragging on the title bar or resize them by clicking on their lower right corner. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find multiple application widgets. By clicking on these buttons, you can open and close widgets on your screen, but it won't remove you from the webinar. A copy of today's slide presentation and additional resources are available for download in the resource list widget. Please note that this webinar has been accepted for 1 CE credit hour towards the AEP designation program. The live broadcast of this event has been approved for 1 CFP board CE credit hour. Investments in Wealth Institute has accepted this program for 1 hour of CE credit towards the CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, and RMA certifications. Instructions for credit submittal are available in the resource list widget. We welcome questions about our topic and will answer as many as we can following the presentation, but feel free to submit yours to the queue at any time. Just type it into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen and hit the submit button. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing following today's event. Simply log in using the same URL as you're using today. Now let me introduce today's speaker. Jeffrey Haskell is Chief Legal Officer of Foundation Source. You can find more information about Jeffrey by clicking on the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen. So with that, let's get started. And Jeffrey, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for having me join you today for this webinar. We're going to talk about compliance with IRS rules and risk mitigation strategies. As a first step, we need to understand why we have these rules. And I often find that it's much easier to understand rules if you understand the reason for them. So let's start with the basics. Although foundations and public charities are both Section 501c3 charitable organizations, private foundations are different in that their funding doesn't come from the public at large, as is the case with many public charities like the Red Cross or the Guggenheim. Rather, a private foundation's funding typically comes from private sources, such as an individual, a family, or a business. As such, a foundation just isn't accountable to the general public in the same way that a public charity is. And as a result, Congress felt that it was necessary to step in and address certain perceived abuses that were aired in congressional hearings back in the 1970s. The rules that we have today were targeted at curing those very abuses. These tax rules make private foundations accountable to the IRS, but another part of the legislative strategy to rein in private foundations is to require them to make their annual returns open to public inspection under the theory that sunlight is the best disinfectant. In fact, a foundation's returns are available nowadays on any number of websites at no charge, and the public can see what expenses were incurred, how much was paid, and the names of the charities that received foundation grants. And often, the returns of foundations associated with celebrities and wealthy families are scrutinized by reporters and by the attorneys general of the state where a foundation is domiciled. And while some states may have attorneys general that are more zealous than others, an attorney general's job, let's not forget, is to monitor the charities in its jurisdiction to ensure that they're acting as they should and to crack down on them when they're not. A key takeaway to remember is that a foundation's actions could expose an individual, a family, or even a business to reputational harm and embarrassment. Now, the board is the governing body of a nonprofit, and the members of a nonprofit board focus on the high-level strategy, oversight, and accountability of the organization. This contrasts with officers, employees, or managers who oversee the nonprofit's day-to-day operations. With a corporation, the board is typically responsible for appointing the organization's officers. Whether a corporation or a trust, board members have fiduciary duties with respect to the organization they serve. And the three types of fiduciary duties applicable to directors of a corporation, which are nearly identical to the duties applicable to trustees, are first, the duty of care, and that directors are expected to take care of the foundation by ensuring prudent use of all of its assets, including its facilities, staff, and goodwill. Second, you have the duty of loyalty. The directors must place the foundation's interests ahead of their own and act at all times in the foundation's interests. Generally, a foundation's conflict of interest policy requires those serving on the foundation to disclose any actual or potential conflicts, and bear in mind that it's important to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And third, we have the duty of obedience. So directors are to ensure that the foundation obeys applicable laws and regulations, that it follows its own laws and policies, its own bylaws, and adheres to its stated mission. Accordingly, we're going to be focusing on the basic compliance rules that every board member should have at least some basic knowledge of. So the IRS's self-dealing rules, we'll start with that, govern transactions between the foundation's insiders, known as disqualified persons, or DPs, and private foundations. Here we have a list of the most common types of transactions with disqualified persons that constitute self-dealing. Notably, the self-dealing rules prohibit even those transactions that would be beneficial to a foundation, such as a disqualified person's sale of property to a foundation at a below-market sweetheart price. In addition to knowing the types of transactions that could result in a violation, it's also important to know the exceptions to the rules so that you're not unnecessarily limiting yourself or the foundation out of sheer ignorance. Importantly, remember that there is no exception to the rule prohibiting sales or exchanges. So, what are the stakes and who is the disqualified person? Because the self-dealing rules only apply to transactions with disqualified persons, the crux of the matter is to understand who and what is a disqualified person. After all, if you're not a disqualified person, you can't be subject to the self-dealing penalties. And aside from those actually serving on the foundation, such as the foundation's officers, directors, and trustees, substantial contributors to the foundation, businesses in which the disqualified persons collectively have a significant ownership stake, and certain family members of disqualified persons are likewise considered to be disqualified persons in their own right. Again, it's not just human beings, it's also entities, certain entities. As an aside, the term family members includes parents and grandparents, children and grandchildren, and the spouses of disqualified persons, but the term excludes siblings and more distant relatives like nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, and cousins. That said, remember that a foundation's returns are open to public inspection, and a foundation's directors and officers would be wise to consider the optics of engaging in a transaction with a family member that may be technically permissible, but that could be viewed negatively. Look, if you're unsure, just remember the tried and true smell test, or as my mother used to say, if you have to ask, the answer is no. So now that we're familiar with what self-dealing is, we need to understand the stakes. I have a chart like this for each type of the violations that we're going to be talking about. So let me just take a moment to explain how these charts are set up. They show which party is subject to a penalty, the foundation, the self-dealer, or the foundation manager, which includes the foundation's officers, directors, and trustees, as well as anyone else who has the power or responsibilities of the foundation officer, director, or trustee, but not the title. As a threshold matter, a violation leads to a first-tier penalty and a requirement that the foundation do something to correct the violation. In some cases, that may mean unwinding the transaction, returning interest or rent paid, vacating rental space, or taking some other form of corrective action. If a violation isn't corrected, especially after the IRS has notified the foundation that it must do so, a very severe second-tier penalty may apply. Now, first-tier taxes often apply whether or not the prohibited action was committed knowingly or innocently. The self-dealing penalty is unique amongst all the penalties because the foundation itself will never owe a penalty. Rather, only the self-dealers are subject to the self-dealing penalties. When a self-dealing violation occurs, both the disqualified person and the foundation alike must file penalty returns form 4720 to report the transaction and calculate the penalty due. Now, as an aside, that can be really counterintuitive because if I'm the foundation and I'm filing a return to report the penalty, I can understand reporting a penalty, but it's always puzzled me and other practitioners why it should be the foundation's job to calculate the penalty due by another taxpayer, the self-dealer in this case. In any event, the penalty is 10% of the amount involved, the definition of which varies depending on the type of self-dealing transaction we're talking about. For example, with a loan, the amount involved is the interest, not the principal amount of the loan. With a sale, however, the amount involved would be the greater of the amount paid or the value of the item sold. Now look, a business person might think that it just may be worth the freight of the 10% penalty to go through with an otherwise forbidden transaction. However, that kind of decision would be disastrous because the IRS will not relent. It will continue reassessing the penalty year after year until corrective action is finally taken. And ultimately, if the disqualified person fails to take corrective action, the IRS can even impose that severe second-tier penalty of double the amount involved. For example, let's say a disqualified person sold a ranch in 2020 for $5 million. Its fair market, and let's just say further that $5 million is its fair market value. So in that case, the disqualified person will owe a $500,000 penalty. If the transaction isn't corrected before the end of the year, another $500,000 penalty will be assessed for 2021, and so on, for each succeeding year until there's been a correction. And ultimately, if the disqualified person refuses to unwind the sale or take other corrective action, if the sale can't be unwound, the IRS can again charge that second-tier penalty of 200% of the amount involved, or $10 million in this case. Now, I didn't mention it on the slide, but there's really the ultimate, doomsday scenario penalty, which is the termination tax, which the IRS can assess in a case where there's flagrant and repeated violations, and there's a whole pattern of this going on. They could say enough is enough, and they could really terminate the foundation's status, and actually, as a penalty, pull in all the foundation's assets, the lesser of that or the aggregate tax benefit. Finally, look, unlike all the penalties for all the other types of violations that we'll be addressing shortly, the IRS cannot forgive a self-dealing penalty even if there's reasonable cause. And the reason why they can't is because the IRS was never given the statutory authority to do so. So here are a few pitfalls to watch out for, none of which are especially intuitive. Donating property subject to a liability is probably the most significant and common pitfall that I see. It's a problem because the IRS would see this as a bargain sale, where the foundation is considered to be purchasing the donated property for an amount equal to the debt relief accorded to the donor. For example, suppose that a disqualified person contributed a $5 million ranch subject to a $100,000 home equity loan, which the disqualified person donor had borrowed several years ago. Now, the net economic benefit to the foundation is $4.9 million. It's not suffering. Because the IRS would see this as a bargain sale, though, the foundation would be considered to have purchased the ranch for $100,000, the amount of the donor's debt relief. You'll recall that the amount involved for a sale is the greater of the amount paid, here $100,000, or the value of the items sold, here $5 million. Therefore, the 10% penalty would apply to the ranch's $5 million value, resulting in a $500,000 penalty owed by the donor. And another pitfall is having the foundation satisfy a pledge to a public charity that was made personally by the disqualified person. That would result in self-dealing because the disqualified person would be relieved of a personal liability by use of the foundation's assets. And finally, watch out for a foundation's purchase of tickets to a charity fundraising event, like a golf outing or a rock concert, only to give those tickets away to disqualified persons who aren't affiliated with the foundation. While a foundation's own officers, directors, or staff may have a legitimate, perfectly legitimate business reason to attend the charity event, providing the tickets to a disqualified person that's not connected or affiliated with the foundation at all will be strictly impermissible. One of the abuses that Congress sought to cure when it enacted these rules back in the 1970s was the parking of the foundation's assets. Where contributions were made to the foundation, the donors had the advantage of immediate charitable deductions, but the contributed funds languished in the foundation's coffers without doing any good. To address this, Congress imposed a minimum 5% annual distribution requirement that can be satisfied by making grants and by paying certain qualifying expenses. Now, except for expenses relating to a foundation's investment assets like bank charges and investment advisory fees, many other overhead expenses like legal, accounting, or philanthropic consulting fees will count towards satisfying the foundation's minimum distribution requirement. Fortunately, also, if the foundation grants more than it's strictly required to grant out in any particular year, any overage or excess can be carried forward and applied to satisfy a future year's distribution requirement. Note that there is a 30% penalty payable by the foundation on any shortfall, but there are no manager level penalties. And as with several of the other foundation compliance rules, this penalty too will be relentlessly reassessed each year until the violation has been corrected by making up the shortfall and making certain special elections on the foundation's annual return. And if it's not timely corrected, the penalty again can increase as much as 100% of the shortfall. So the first order of business here to mitigate risk is knowing what your foundation's minimum distribution requirement is. That amount can be found on the foundation's annual return, the 990-PF, in what's now Part 12, formerly Part 13. Specifically, each annual return calculates the following tax year's minimum payout requirement based on the return year's average investment asset values. For example, the 2019 annual return would determine and state the 2020 minimum payout requirement. Once you know what the foundation's minimum payout requirement is for a given year, be sure to track the foundation's satisfaction of that requirement throughout the year. In a case where the return is expected to be filed very late in the tax year, it's probably best to work with a professional who can provide reasonable estimates of the payout requirement early in the year. And note that even if a foundation is on the accrual method of accounting for financial reporting purposes, it's required to track satisfaction of this minimum payout requirement using the cash method of accounting, which means that a qualifying expense will not count towards satisfying the minimum distribution requirement until it's been paid, regardless of when the expense was accrued for financial reporting purposes. And also, be on the lookout for what I call cash flow drag. Because if you have an asset that doesn't produce an income stream, remember that the foundation's annual minimum payout requirement will be driven, at least in part, by that asset's value. So for instance, if the foundation owns a vacant lot that's worth $5 million, the foundation's ownership of that lot will cause its minimum payout requirement to increase by roughly $250,000 per year, again, which is simply 5% of $5 million. If the lot is the foundation's only asset or comprises the bulk of the foundation's portfolio, the foundation could find itself in a cash flow crunch because it may lack the liquid funds needed to satisfy its minimum payout requirement and cover its other operating expenses. And that can be especially debilitating, again, if the asset is liquid and they can't sell it quickly. Moving over to the excess business holdings universe, Congress wanted foundations to remain focused on their charitable missions, not on the concerns a large stakeholder would normally have in running a successful business. Therefore, Congress enacted the excess business holdings rules, which place a cap on the collective percentage of ownership that a foundation and its disqualified persons can have in an active business. The default cap is typically 20%, but in some cases might be increased to 35%. Congress provides a 5-year grace period in connection with any lifetime gifts or requests of ownership interest in active businesses that might otherwise have resulted in an excess business holding violation, but for the grace period. In other cases, where either the foundation or disqualified person acquired an ownership stake that unknowingly caused their aggregate holdings to exceed that permissible cap, a much shorter 90-day grace period will apply instead to resolve the problem. And note that although an ownership interest in a passive investment vehicle is not subject to the excess business holding rules, a foundation may be deemed to have an indirect ownership interest in a downstream business enterprise that's held by the investment vehicle. For example, let's say a foundation owns 100% of a passive holding company, and that company owns 50% of an active business. So in that case, the foundation would be deemed to look through and have a 50% indirect ownership interest in the active business. Famously, many of you may have heard about Newman's Own, how they lobbied heavily for an exception to the rule, and they were ultimately successful, but the exception came with very strict requirements that are so strict that many other foundations and businesses may find it extremely difficult to qualify for that exception. The maximum ownership level that's allowed under the rules is considered the permitted holdings, and anything beyond that is considered excess holdings, which is subject to a 10% penalty, as you can see here. So as a practical matter, a private foundation that invests exclusively in publicly traded securities typically doesn't have to worry about this type of violation because it will be rare indeed for a foundation to own more than a 2% interest in a publicly traded company. Rather, this is really more of a concern when you have a foundation investing in privately held companies, whether they're organized as corporations, partnerships, LLCs, or even as trusts. If a foundation owns no more than 2% by vote and value of an active business, the rules won't apply, which basically means you could ignore the holdings of the disqualified persons. So this is known as the de minimis exception to the rules. Also, there is no cap on a foundation's direct ownership interest in a passive investment vehicle, which I alluded to a moment ago. If the foundation owns more than a 2% interest in an active business, what you need to do is aggregate the foundation's and a disqualified person's collective holdings to see if their pooled interest exceeds the permissible cap, which again, I said is usually 20%. To do this, the foundation should institute a protocol for periodically tracking the holdings of its disqualified persons, its insiders in that business. As we learned earlier, disqualified persons can include individuals who don't serve on the foundation themselves. Therefore, the foundation's inquiries must extend beyond merely the disqualified persons who happen to be serving on the foundation. For instance, suppose that a foundation owns and purchases a 10% interest in a business enterprise, and at the time, no other disqualified person has an interest in that business, so everything's fine. But suppose that later on, president's grandfather, who isn't even on the foundation, never contributed anything to it, later purchases a 30% interest in that business. If the foundation instituted a protocol for tracking the holdings of its insiders, including those not affiliated with the foundation, like the grandpa, the foundation could catch and correct the problem without a penalty. As a practical matter, it may be impossible for a foundation to own more than a de minimis 2% interest in a family business because the aggregate of the foundation's holdings and that of its disqualified persons, family members, may well exceed the maximum ownership cap that's allowed. However, if the foundation finds that it holds more than a 2% interest in a passive investment vehicle, again, no special track procedure should be required if the vehicle itself is only invested downstream in publicly traded companies, or if it holds only a very small interest in active business enterprises. Now, private foundation managers are required to apply ordinary business care and prudence in selecting investments to avoid jeopardizing the foundation's ability to carry out its charitable mission. In other words, you have to invest in such a risky, harebrained way that you're putting the foundation's very existence at risk or in jeopardy. These rules generally parallel state law in that the directors and trustees of private foundations have a fiduciary responsibility to follow the prudent investor standards, including requirements for diversification. Notably, the regulations clarify that no investment class is automatically, per se, considered to be a jeopardizing investment. In determining jeopardy, each investment is analyzed on a case-by-case basis in light of the overall portfolio. In fact, a sound investment strategy might call for making what might appear otherwise to be a very risky investment so as to hedge the foundation's risk. In addition, the expectation here is that the foundation managers will make these deliberations before making an investment, rather than just recklessly rushing in without prudent forethought. In fact, the IRS generally doesn't second-guess a board's business judgment. They don't like to do that. And so the thing that you also have to keep in mind is that these rules are not applied in hindsight. They're applied on the basis of what the foundation investment folks knew at the time of the investment. If it ends up being a lousy investment, you don't play Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, it must have been jeopardizing. Both the federal, by the way, state and state law regulations allow a foundation's managers to consider any special relationship or value that an asset may have with the foundation's charitable mission or purpose when evaluating the reasonableness of an investment. For instance, a foundation may choose one investment over another, even if the chosen investment generates a lower rate of return, so long as it aligns or furthers the foundation's mission better than the alternative investment would. And finally, bear in mind that these rules apply only to investments that are purchased by the foundation, not to assets that are contributed to it. We see here that there is a first-tier tax for both the foundation and the managers, but the manager tax applies only if the manager willfully made the investment, knowing that it constituted a jeopardizing investment. Now, to avoid the possibility of making a jeopardizing investment, foundation managers should be sure to follow the prudent investor rules. And if they're not familiar with those rules, they may delegate to a professional investment advisor. Also, an advisor may help the foundation draft a formal investment policy if the foundation's managers lack the experience to draft one on their own. As we noted earlier, the IRS really wants the foundation's managers to evaluate the reasonableness of an investment before moving forward with the investment. That's why the foundation's managers should document, possibly with the help of an advisor, that they did so, that they made the investment in compliance with the foundation's investment policy and the prudent investor rules before or contemporaneously with the making of an especially risky investment. I've seen the foundations have, special board meetings if they're going to make a very large and risky investment to reflect in the minutes the reasons why they made the investment and why they think that it's a prudent investment to make, given all the facts and circumstances. Now, the general rule here is that all private foundation expenditures must be made for charitable purposes. However, Some types of expenditures are prohibited by congressional fiat, such as those involving lobbying, electioneering, and voter registration drives. That being said, there may be such a fine line between permissible actions and those that are flatly prohibited, like the difference between permissible advocacy on one hand and prohibited lobbying on the other, that can confuse folks. While a foundation can freely make grants to most charities that are classified by the IRS as public charities without any special oversight, grants made to other types of organizations generally are permissible only if certain procedures are followed. So, like, you can do it as long as you follow the procedures. For example, grants made to domestic or foreign organizations that are not public charities can be made by following special procedures known as expenditure responsibility. These procedures generally entail due diligence, special grant letter terms, and reporting requirements. If a foundation wishes to make a grant to a foreign charity, an NGO, a non-governmental organization, an alternate approach known as qualifying as making an equivalency determination may be a viable option for the foundation to pursue. Under this alternate approach, what happens is that the foundation makes a determination, if it's able to, that the foreign entity is the equivalent of a U.S. public charity. So in other words, when a U.S. public charity applies to the IRS for recognition, it has to jump through a number of hoops and show that it satisfies various tests. And so a foreign charity would have to do the same, or at least be able to pass those same tests, whether they apply to the IRS or not. Well, likewise, although a foundation may make grants to individuals, certain types of grants require advance IRS approval of the overall grant program. Scholarships, fellowships, and travel study grant programs fall into that category, while hardship and disaster relief grant programs may be made without advance IRS approval at all. Again, the risk here is primarily on the private foundation. And as with all the other penalties, the penalty amount can increase dramatically if not timely corrected, such that second-tier tax kicks in. Well, the first order of business when making an expenditure is understanding whether it's flat out prohibited or not. For a grant to an organization, you'll need to research the organization's tax status so you can figure out whether special procedures need to be implemented to make that grant. Note that if special procedures like expenditure responsibility are needed, it's important to follow them to the letter perfectly, because a violation can result even if one small step is missed because the rules are strictly applied. For example, forgetting to report the grant on the foundation's annual return each year until the grant funds are fully spent down can result in a taxable expenditure, even if all the other procedures are followed perfectly, and you can't cure that by just filing an amended return. If making a grant to an individual, by the way, it's necessary to determine whether the foundation has to obtain advance IRS approval of a grant program prior to making any such grants. And finally, you have to keep in mind that you must avoid earmarking when granting to a public charity. Earmarking happens when a foundation makes a grant to an individual, but directs that organization to re-grant those funds to a particular organization or individual. Under the earmarking rules, the foundation is considered to have made it directly to the designated organization or individual who received the grant funds. So if the foundation has not followed any required special procedures because it didn't think it had to, the earmarking will result in a violation. So in sum, earmarking does not allow a foundation to avoid complying with special procedures simply by making grants to public charities and using them as agents or conduits for delivering grant funds to other organizations or particular individuals. And we'll focus a bit more on that towards the end of the presentation. So generally, when a foundation makes a grant to a U.S. public charity, as I've said, expenditure responsibility, special oversight isn't necessary. Why? Because the charity itself is subject to federal tax laws governing 501c3 organizations like the requirement to operate exclusively for charitable purposes. By contrast, a grant recipient that's not a 501c3 organization isn't subject to those special, let's call them altruistic or charitable tax rules. So the goal of expenditure responsibility then is to subject the recipient to the essence of these altruistic rules by contract law, by requiring them to sign a written contractual agreement that contains specific terms that the regulations say must be in those agreements. And aside from requiring that the grantee report on its use of the grant funds, the regulations require the grant letter agreement, again, to contain the special terms that would require, for example, the funds to be returned if they're not used for the charitable purpose, or the program that was funded is canceled, for argument's sake. Let's turn now to grants to individuals. So whenever you have a private foundation considering making grants to individuals, so the very first thing it has to do is determine whether the IRS's advance approval is needed. Now, the general rule of thumb here is that IRS approval isn't necessary if the grant has no strings, by which I mean future conditions that are attached to it. If there are no strings, the grantee wouldn't be required to spend down the grant funds in any particular way. And there are two types of grant to individuals that do not require IRS approval. The first type is grant to individuals for the purpose of alleviating human suffering. Now, the IRS regulations refer to financial hardship grants to indigent individuals in the parlance of the regs. Unfortunately, there's been very little IRS guidance on what makes a person indigent. Now, what some foundations do is they piggyback off of a federal, state, or local government's determination that a person has qualified for participation in a government-run program available only to the financially needy, like maybe like a school lunch program or the like. Grants to victims of an emergency or natural disaster, for example, also serve the purpose of alleviating human suffering, and likewise do not require IRS approval. The other category that doesn't require IRS approval is grants to individuals made in recognition of past accomplishments, which includes prizes and awards. Now, although in these cases the grantee must have done something specific to receive the prize or award, like, for example, write the best poem, write the best essay, whatever, and that could almost seem like it's a string, those activities must have already taken place, however, so no future action would actually be required by the recipient. In other words, you could look at this and think that there's a string, but there is no string because they don't have to do anything with the money. It's for what they've already done, not what they're going to do. So as long as the grantee isn't required to spend the grant funds in any particular way, the grant won't require IRS approval. The Internal Revenue Code provides that any grant to an individual for travel, study, or similar purposes, that's the key phrase in the code, will be a taxable expenditure unless the IRS's approval is obtained prior to making the grant. Code elaborates a bit on what is meant by travel, study, or other similar purposes, and tells us that there are a few specific types of grants to individuals that require advance IRS approval. So first, any scholarship or fellowship grant to an individual will require advance IRS approval, whether it's made directly to the individual or to an educational institution for the benefit of an individual. Additionally, grants made to individuals to achieve a specific objective, produce a report, or other similar product will also require advance IRS approval. And lastly, grants made to improve or enhance a literary, artistic, musical, scientific, teaching, or other similar capacity, skill, or talent of the grantee will need IRS approval. I remember one unique case where we had a YouTuber who was developing educational content, and that counted as achieving an objective. And we had another person who set up a program that provided scholarships for tennis, because physical instruction also counts as educational. not just mental education. Physical education counts also for this purpose. So note that when advanced IRS approval is required, the foundation need only obtain approval of its grant-making program for the overall procedures only one time. In other words, the good news is that approval isn't needed for each and every grant. Once the IRS approves the grant-making program overall, the foundation can continue making grants to individuals, definitely under that program, provided that it doesn't change the attributes of the program and that it follows the procedures that were originally submitted to the IRS for approval. So there are two ways for a foundation to request advanced IRS approval. If the foundation knows early on that it wants to make grants that require advance approval, and it's settled on all the details of the program, including eligibility and selection criteria, it can request the IRS's advance approval as part of its Form 1023 filing with no additional user fee charged. However, at the very beginning of their life cycles, many foundations don't know exactly how they want their granting program to run. And in that case, the foundation, if it needs more time to crystallize its thoughts and who it wants to help and why, and et cetera, the foundation could always request approval after filing Form 1023 by filing Form 8940 instead and paying the appropriate user fee that's then in effect for that form. So what's the appropriate timing for requesting IRS approval? Well, it's crucial to obtain IRS approval of the grant-making procedures prior to making any grants to individuals that require that kind of approval to avoid triggering a taxable expenditure penalty, which we've said, again, is pretty steep, 20%. Although there is a special exception available for those who aren't faint of heart. So that special exception, known as the 45-day rule, says that 45 days after the foundation has, air quotes, properly submitted its request for IRS approval, grants individuals made by the foundation in line with those procedures won't result in a taxable expenditure as long as the foundation hasn't been notified by the IRS that its procedures are unacceptable, that there's a problem. So in that case, they'll wait for 45 days to elapse. They haven't heard anything, they'll start making grants. But the issue here is, did the IRS really consider the application to have been properly submitted in the first instance? Because if it was defective in some way, maybe it didn't talk about how it was maintaining records. Maybe it didn't go into detail about the eligibility or selection criteria, et cetera. You have that risk that the foundation wasn't entitled to have relied on that 45-day rule. And so whatever it did, without having obtained IRS approval, will be subject to a penalty. So anyway, it's a tricky question here, and it creates a certain level of risk relying on the 45-day rule. So many foundations, really most in my experience, choose to wait until they receive formal written approval from the IRS rather than rely on this special 45-day rule. Now, there are a number of universal rules that apply when making grants to individuals, regardless of whether advance approval is necessary. First, in no event can a foundation make a grant to a disqualified person, an insider, as self-dealing would result. And that's true, and maybe people are surprised that that's true, despite the grant's charitable nature. So like, even if it's indisputably charitable, it doesn't matter. You can't do it if it's self-dealing. Also, grantees must be selected from a broad charitable class, meaning that the group must be large enough to ensure that the number of individuals comprising the class isn't fixed. So that's why the foundation should develop a channel to refer individuals who aren't already known to the board. For example, social workers, the clergy, nurses, staff at a shelter or a food pantry, and the like can be excellent sources of referral. In fact, after 9/11, you had many of these disaster relief organizations had in mind this broad charitable class requirement. So they would say the victims of 9/11 and future disasters. Because if they said just the victims of 9/11, it could have been a finite list. But by making it open-ended by saying future disasters, they complied with a broad charitable class requirement. Similarly, if you say, I want to provide scholarships to the graduating class of 2023, that's pretty finite. I could get out of a legal pad and I could write down the names of all the people graduating. But if I say the graduating class of 23 and future classes from that particular high school, so you don't know who's going to be graduating from high school for all time, that makes the class open-ended and really constitute a broad-chartable class. So additionally, the foundation's eligibility and selection criteria must be reasonably related to the purpose of the grant. For example, if the purpose of the grant program is to provide education to those suffering from financial need, it wouldn't make sense to limit eligibility to those who have red hair and green eyes. It almost goes without saying, but grantees also have to be selected on a fair and even-handed basis, or in the parlance of the reg and the code, in an objective and non-discriminatory basis. And logically, the foundation has to develop a means to publicize the program. After all, if no candidates are referred to the foundation and nobody applies for help because the only ones who know about the foundation's program are the foundation's own officers and directors, then how can you say that the grantees are selected from a broad charitable class? Because the list would be a finite group, would be only those folks that are known to the board and officers. That's pretty finite. And finally, the foundation has to maintain detailed records with respect to the program. So in addition to the universal rules that we just went over, there are a few rules that apply specifically to grants individuals that require advance approval. So in this case, the foundation has to obtain annual reports from grantees, investigate any possible diversion or misuse of grant funds, and retain detailed records with respect to those grants. Now, those records should include the information that was obtained to evaluate potential grantees, for example, application, essays submitted with an application, and the like, the identity of grantees with sufficient information so the foundation can rule out the possibility that the applicant is a disqualified person. You have to record the amount and purpose of each grant, and the grantee's annual and final reports, and any other documentation that may exist relating to any investigation the foundation may have conducted regarding a potential diversion of grant funds. For scholarship and fellowship grants, there's a shortcut for satisfying the reporting and investigation requirements. Those requirements are deemed satisfied as long as the grant funds are paid directly to the college or university, the educational institution. And the educational institution has to agree to apply those funds to the grantee's educational costs only if the grantee is actually enrolled at the institution and the grantee's standing is consistent with the purposes and conditions of the grant. So for example, the person has to have a mathematics major as part of the conditions for qualifying for the scholarship, and they switch to political science. That might be, for example, a trigger that would require the institution to return scholarship funds. So let's take a little closer look now at earmarking, something I went over before, but worth going over in a little more detail because it's so commonly overlooked and misunderstood. As I said earlier, an earmark grant is a grant to an organization that we'll call the direct grantee. And in this scenario, the grantor requires the direct grantee to re-grant the grant funds to another organization or to an individual that we'll call the indirect grantee. For example, suppose that a foundation makes a grant to public charity A, the direct grantee, and requires public charity A to transfer the grant funds to foreign organization B, the indirect grantee. So just to be clear, the intended beneficiary of the foundation's largesse, as it was always the foreign organization B, the indirect grantee. The grantor just is using the public charity A as a means, as a vehicle to get those funds over to the indirect grantee. And again, why would it do that? Well, because the foundation thinks it's pretty smart and that thinks that it can skirt the compliance rules by making the grant to direct grantee A, the public charity, because it expects that special oversight won't be needed. Now, the IRS deems an earmark grant, as I said, to be made from the foundation directly to the indirect grantee. If the foundation mistakenly thought that the oversight wasn't necessary because the grant funds were routed through a public charity, the foundation will be subject to taxable expenditure penalties. Generally, a grant made to a direct grantee won't be considered a grant to another entity or as a scholarship grant to an individual. So everything will be good as long as the grant was not earmarked for an indirect grantee. There's no oral or written agreement giving the foundation the ability to select the grantees, and the direct grantee exercises control over the selection process and actually makes a selection completely independently of the foundation. That said, I guess the foundation could make a grant and maybe make a recommendation with no binding requirement. But again, a lot of times what you'll see, we'll get to the next slide here, is a different approach. So if an educational institution selects scholarship recipients under that institution's own scholarship program, the foundation's grant to that institution's scholarship program won't be considered an earmarked grant to an individual. Rather, the grant will be deemed made to the educational institution. Look, sometimes educational institutions will adopt and run a scholarship program designed by the foundation. For example, a foundation might design and fund a program for residents of a particular county that are in financial need and want to pursue a career in engineering. So what actually happens when there's an earmarked grant that's made to another organization? So there, a taxable expenditure will be triggered because the foundation, again, mistakenly thinking that oversight measures have been skirted, wouldn't have exercised expenditure responsibility or payment equivalency determination. And similarly, with the indirect grantee as an individual, a scholarship or fellowship recipient, a taxable expenditure penalty would have been triggered because the foundation, again, mistakenly thinking that the need for advance approval has been skirted, wouldn't have obtained the IRS's advance approval of the foundation's scholarship program. And with that, we can open up the floor to any questions.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeffrey. And we do have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to start. Would you agree with our understanding that when a foundation makes a donation to a sponsor, to sponsor an event, the foundation donor president must not accept free tickets to or gifts from that event? We have our donor president write a personal check for tickets raffles, but nonprofits don't seem to understand the importance of this practice, and they're asking for your take on that.
Yeah, so look, there's a famous letter ruling out there where, in fact, a president wanted to go to some sort of charity dinner, I suppose. And you'll recall that anytime you get some sort of tax receipt from a charity for going to an event, the receipt will generally say, here was the value of goods and services provided, so the booze, the liquor, the meal, the entertainment, and then it'll explain, the balance is for charitable purposes. And the part that's for charitable purposes, what you could take as a deduction if you're an individual who made the grant. So all these tax receipts say that. In this case, what the individual wanted to do, the president, they wanted to pay for the booze and the liquor, the services provided piece, and they wanted the foundation to pay for the charitable piece. And letter ruling found that that would be self-dealing because the president was effectively, bootstrapping that. But for the foundation, paying the charitable component, the president couldn't have waltzed into the event and just elected to pay for the booze, the liquor, and the entertainment. So that said, there is an understanding in other letter rulings that allow a foundation's authors, directors, and staff to go to events if it serves a foundation purpose. So, for example, let's say there's a charity that the foundation wants to show support to. So, in effect, it might send its officers or directors to that event as ambassadors of the foundation as a show of support. Sometimes, for example, if there are celebrities or well-known in the business world, a foundation's officers going to an event can be an inducement to draw for other people to go to the event, contributing to the overall success of the event. But definitely charity, raffles, auctions, all that should really be made with personal funds, not with the foundation's funds.
Okay. Some foundations have members and a board of directors. What are their different duties?
Okay, so typically when you see a membership structure, a working membership structure, it's effectively a three-tier structure. So at the bottom, you have the officers that are running the day-to-day operations. Those officers are typically appointed by the board of directors. And in a true membership structure, you have the board of directors in turn appointed by the member or the members. So you might have a corporate foundation, for example, where the member is a corporation, and the member corporation will appoint as member directors of a charity that it's funding, and those directors will appoint the officers. So that's how you typically see a membership organization working in this context.
Okay, we have a follow-up to that first question. What about spouses of officers at the charitable fundraising event?
Right. So that is, it's funny because I used to go to presentations and speak with people who talked about so this is like really ancient, the sparkling spouse rule. Yeah, that would be a no. I would certainly advise any foundation that has a spouse who's not serving on the foundation. It's another story if the spouse is serving on the foundation also as a board member, director, an officer, whatever, staff. But if the spouse doesn't have anything to do with the foundation, that should be paid out of pocket. The foundation should not pay for that.
Okay, all right. So now focusing on the issues that you address regarding self-dealing annual payout, can you summarize any differences between private foundations organized as corporations and PFs organized as trusts?
Yeah, the self-dealing rules will apply whether or not the foundation is organized as a trust or as a corporation. So it has no bearing in that respect.
Can you briefly discuss the lobbying and grassroots ceilings applicable to foundations, along with the risks associated with supporting political candidates?
So that's really could be like an hour-long presentation in its own right. I'll just very briefly from like 10,000 feet on that. So the idea is that public charities generally are allowed to engage in some amount of lobbying. They can't freely engage in lobbying. There's a cap and measurements for how much they can in fact lobby. By contrast, foundations may not lobby at all. Like it's completely verboten. And so foundations have to be very careful of engaging in lobbying to influence legislation. And so there's a fine line, I mentioned this in my presentation, between lobbying, that's forbidden, and advocacy, which is okay. The question is how you're doing it. And again, there are rules that talk about whether or not there's specific legislation, whether or not you're speaking to a member of a legislative body, and the like. So anyway, I wish I could talk more about it, but in the time that we have, I can't get into more detail than just touching on it very briefly like that.
What is a reasonable amount to pay directors for attending a board meeting, and how is this determined?
So generally the rule here is that foundations are not allowed to pay compensation unless it's reasonable, necessary, not excessive, etc. There are articles on this, some of which have been printed in T&E magazine on the subject, the art of setting board comp. Generally, the short answer is that foundations often look to what other foundations of a similar size are paying board members for like services and the like. And there are in fact surveys that are printed by various organizations that break out by foundation size or budget what kind of stipends are typically paid to foundations. So I can't give you a magic number and say here's the amount. You need to look at a recent or current study that evaluates the foundation's overall by that kind of grouping, figure out where your foundation falls in that grouping and extrapolate from there.
Okay, well, it looks like we are running out of time, but if your questions haven't been answered, we will be sending those questions to Jeffrey after the webinar, and he can get back to you at his discretion. He'll have your information to do that. So again, I'd like to thank our speaker, Jeffrey Haskell, for an outstanding presentation. And we'd also like to thank Foundation Source for making today's webinar possible. Once you leave the event, a short survey will pop up in your browser window, And we'd appreciate it if you'd share your feedback on this event, as it helps us to provide you with the content that is most interesting for you. On behalf of Trust and Estates, have a great day.